A year before, he was a shy session musician nobody outside the British music industry had heard of, scraping together a living writing songs for other people to sing. Then one song changed everything, almost overnight. This is the story of the song that made Elton John a millionaire. Before anyone knew his name, a songwriter nobody could place.
Hope you don't mind, I hope you don't mind.
In 1967, a young pianist from Pinner, England named Reginald Kenneth Dwight answered a classified advertisement in the New Musical Express. Liberty Records was looking for new songwriters, and Dwight, who had been playing piano by ear since the age of 3, had later completed formal musical training as a teenager and had won a scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music, and who had already spent years performing in a band called Bluesology, went in for an audition. He told the man behind the desk plainly that he could write music but had no ability to write lyrics. The interviewer handed him a sealed envelope from a stack of unsolicited submissions sitting on the desk. Inside were poems written by a 17-year-old farmer's son from Lincolnshire named Bernie Taupin, who had answered the very same advertisement and also failed the audition that day, the two men having never crossed paths in person at all. Dwight took the envelope home on the London Underground, opened it during the ride, and began setting Taupin's words to music almost immediately. Neither of them had passed the Liberty Records audition that brought them into the same building on the same day, but the partnership that began in that sealed envelope would become one of the most productive and enduring songwriting relationships in the history of popular music. The very first song the two of them produced together was called Scarecrow. Within 6 months of meeting, Dwight had taken on a new stage name, borrowing it from two former Bluesology bandmates, saxophonist Elton Dean and singer Long John Baldry, to become Elton John, though he would not legally change his name to Elton Hercules John until January 1972. For the next 2 years, John and Taupin worked as staff songwriters for Dick James Music, the publishing company that also handled the Beatles catalog, and was run by Dick James, a man whose stature in the British music industry was already enormous by the time the two young songwriters walked through his door, having built his reputation on the strength of his association with the biggest band in the world. Their job was to write material for other artists, churning out songs for performers like Lulu and Roger Cook, with Taupin dashing off lyrics, sometimes in under an hour, and John setting them to music almost as quickly as the pages reached him, rarely revising any lyric he could not engage with immediately. The two men almost never sat in the same room while writing. Their entire working method, from the very beginning, was built around Taupin, delivering finished lyrics, and John composing music separately, with no back-and-forth collaboration in the way two songwriters might typically work side by side.
My gift is my song, and this one's for you.
John also worked as a session musician and demo singer during this period, recording other people's songs as guide vocals and playing piano on records for established acts, picking up whatever paying work the publishing house could find for him. It was steady work. It paid modestly, covering rent and little more. And almost nobody outside the small world of the British music publishing industry knew his name, let alone what he looked like or what he sounded like as a performer, rather than a hired hand. A song written at the breakfast table. By 1969, Taupin had moved out of Lincolnshire entirely and was living with John at the home of John's mother and stepfather in Northwood Hills, a London suburb, sharing close quarters with the family in a way that speaks to how little money either man had at the time, despite their growing songwriting output. One morning at the kitchen table, sometime that year, Taupin sat with a lined notepad and wrote the lyrics to a song in roughly 10 to 15 minutes. He has described the moment plainly and consistently in interviews over the decades. He scribbled the words down at breakfast time at that kitchen table, handed them to John, and John began setting them to music almost immediately, singing along as he worked out the melody at the piano. John's mother, overhearing from the next room, remarked simply that she liked the one he was working on, an offhand comment from a woman who had no idea she was reacting to what would become one of the most enduring songs of the entire decade. A persistent and widely repeated story claims that Topin actually wrote the lyrics while sitting on the roof of 20 Denmark Street in London, where John supposedly worked as an office boy for a music publishing firm, with the lyric referencing kicking moss off a rooftop. Topin himself has firmly denied this version of events, pointing out that John had already stopped working at that address by the time the two men had even met. The breakfast table version, told consistently by Topin across many decades of interviews, remains the account both men have stood behind.
It may be quite simple, but
The song was Your Song. It would become, by both Topin's and John's own repeated accounts in later interviews, the best work either of them had ever done together. A love song built around plain, unpolished sincerity rather than poetic flourish, which is exactly what gave it its staying power. John has said in interviews that he never wrote a love song quite as good again, calling it simply a perfect song, and noting that the lyrics mean more to him the older he gets rather than less. Topin, for his part, has described the song as being like an old friend, something that means different things on different levels, depending on when in life a person happens to hear it, comparing it in one interview to a loyal dog that's simply always there.
you can tell everybody.
The song's actual commercial debut, however, did not belong to Elton John at all. The American band Three Dog Night had already recorded both Lady Samantha and Your Song as album tracks, having been introduced to John's demos by their bandmate Danny Hutton, who had been in contact with Dick James Music while scouting material in London during a visit roughly 14 months before John's own American debut. Three Dog Night included Your Song on their 1970 album It Ain't Easy, released that March, well before John's own version had even been recorded. They made a deliberate decision not to release it as a single. John was, at the time, performing as their opening act on certain dates, and the band chose to let the young songwriter have the opportunity to record and release his own version first, rather than competing with him for ownership of the same song in the marketplace. A remarkably generous gesture from an already successful American act toward a completely unknown British songwriter they barely knew personally.
My gift is my song, yeah. And this one,
The album that almost didn't make a splash.
hope you don't mind, hope you don't mind that I put
John recorded his own version of Your Song at Trident Studios in London in January 1970, with producer Gus Dudgeon and arranger Paul Buckmaster shaping the sound of what would become his self-titled second album, working at a pace that left little room for second-guessing arrangements. The pairing of John with Dudgeon and Buckmaster represented a significant creative shift from his debut album Empty Sky, released the previous year in 1969, which had made very little commercial impression and had not yet found the right combination of collaborators to fully realize what John and Topin were capable of as songwriters. Buckmaster, who would go on to work with John across multiple albums, later described the working relationship as one in which he felt total creative freedom, recalling decisions like replacing a piano part with a harp on one track simply because he felt the song called for it, with John and his managers giving him essentially complete artistic license to follow his instincts. The album, titled simply Elton John, was released that April on DJM Records and Pi Records in the United Kingdom, and on Uni Records in the United States. The latter a relatively new label still building its roster, and willing to take a chance on an unproven British act that virtually every other American label had already passed on signing.
How wonderful life is.
The first single pulled from the album was Border Song, which made only a modest chart impression, peaking at number 92 on the Billboard Hot 100, hardly the kind of number that would have suggested a coming commercial explosion. Your Song did not arrive as a single at all at first. It was held back, tucked away as the opening track on the album, while the label waited to see how the record would perform on its own merits without additional promotional push. When it was finally released in the United States in October 1970, it wasn't even given top billing. It went out as the B-side to another track, Take Me to the Pilot, a decision that reflected how little confidence the label initially had in the song's commercial potential compared to its intended companion track.
How wonderful life is.
What happened next is one of those moments where audience preference simply overrode the original commercial plan. in a pattern that echoes how several other beloved songs of that era found their audiences. Radio disc jockeys across the country began playing Your Song instead of the intended A-side. It happened often enough, and consistently enough, that Take Me to the Pilot was effectively swapped out, and Your Song became the actual single being promoted and pushed by the label. It climbed to number 7 on the UK singles chart and number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. Elton John's first hit single anywhere in the world as a performer, arriving more than 3 years after he had first answered that classified ad and failed his audition alongside a stranger, who would go on to write the words to nearly every song that defined his career.
I know it's not much, but it's the best.
6 Nights in West Hollywood. By the time Your Song was climbing the American charts, Elton John had already done something that, in hindsight, sealed his transformation from working songwriter to genuine star. Before that breakthrough, his commercial prospects in the United States had looked genuinely uncertain. In a UK industry poll conducted by Record Mirror in 1970, John had been voted only the 5th most promising pop act in the country, and virtually every American record label aside from Uni Records had passed on signing him at all, in part because his singing voice struck some listeners as awkwardly mid-Atlantic, neither distinctly British nor American in its delivery. On August 25, 1970, he made his United States concert debut at the Troubadour, a small 300-seat club on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood, sharing the bill that week with one of his musical heroes, the singer-songwriter David Ackles, as part of a run that had been arranged after Jerry Perenchio, chairman of the Chartwell Talent Agency, heard the Elton John album while in London, and was excited enough to personally commit to bringing the young performer to America. The audience that first night included an extraordinary concentration of music industry figures and future legends: Quincy Jones, Leon Russell, Beach Boys members Mike Love and Brian Wilson, Linda Ronstadt, Gordon Lightfoot, Randy Newman, future Eagles members Glenn Frey and Don Henley, and Danny Hutton of Three Dog Night, the very band that had already recorded 2 of John's songs before he'd had the chance to release them himself. Neil Diamond personally introduced John to the stage, reportedly nervous on his behalf and telling the crowd plainly that he had never done this kind of introduction before and intended to simply take a seat among them and enjoy the show. John opened the set with Your Song, backed only by bassist Dee Murray and drummer Nigel Olsson, before moving through a set that included Border Song, 60 Years On, Take Me to the Pilot, and even a cover of the Rolling Stones' Honky Tonk Women.
This is the song in me.
The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Los Angeles Times music critic Robert Hilburn wrote a review the following day under the headline, Elton John, New Rock Talent, predicting that the performance was merely the beginning of what would become one of rock's biggest and most important careers, writing that the Tuesday night show was, in his words, just the beginning. Reporters from Time and Newsweek were reportedly in attendance as well, helping push the story of John's arrival into the national media conversation almost immediately. A remarkable level of mainstream press attention for a performer who, only days earlier, had been completely unknown to American audiences outside a small circle of industry insiders. Troubadour owner Doug Weston, who had run the club for 18 years by that point and had hosted countless rising acts over that span, later said he had never seen any artist capture the town as completely and thoroughly as John did that week, calling it nothing short of phenomenal that a total unknown could generate such an overwhelmingly positive response from a room full of people who had never heard him perform live before. Russ Reagan, the president of Uni Records, later said he was too excited to function normally for 2 full days afterward, joking that although only roughly 300 people had actually been in that small room, decades later it seemed like everyone he ever spoke to claimed to have been one of them, joking that by that logic, there must have been 30,000 people crammed into the Troubadour that night.
Hold me closer, time to dance.
The 6-night run at the Troubadour, which included 2 shows a night on the busiest evenings, has since been described by multiple people who witnessed it as one of the defining moments in rock and roll history, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of how completely and immediately it changed the way the American music industry and American audiences understood who Elton John was. Within weeks, the Elton John album entered the US albums chart and eventually climbed to number 4 over a chart run that stretched 51 weeks. An extraordinarily long and steady commercial life for a debut release by a previously unknown artist. From unknown to wealthy, almost overnight. What happened to Elton John's finances over the next several months mirrored what happened to his fame, and it happened just as fast. Before Your Song and the Troubadour shows, John had been earning a working musician's income. Modest songwriting fees from Dick James Music, session work, and the kind of steady but unspectacular paychecks that came with writing material for other performers, rather than for himself. He was not poor by the standards of a young British musician in the late 1960s, but he was nowhere close to wealthy, and almost nobody beyond the British music industry could have picked him out of a crowd or named a single song he had personally performed. That changed within a matter of months. As Your Song climbed the charts on both sides of the Atlantic and the Elton John album became a substantial commercial success, royalty income began flowing in at a scale entirely different from anything John had experienced as a staff songwriter. Touring income followed immediately behind it, as promoters who had never heard of him a year earlier were now booking him into larger and larger venues across the United States, and ticket demand grew with each subsequent appearance. Just 3 months after the Troubadour run, John returned to the Los Angeles area to open for Leon Russell. And from that point forward, according to those who worked closely with him at the time, it was one significant commercial success after another, with his profile and his earnings climbing together at a pace few young performers ever experience. By 1971, John was releasing albums at a pace that matched his sudden commercial momentum: Tumbleweed Connection, the soundtrack album Friends, the live recording November 17th, 70, and Madman Across the Water, which produced further hits including Tiny Dancer and Levon. And the income from that accelerating catalog compounded on itself with each new release, building on a foundation that had not existed at all a mere 18 months earlier. 4 separate albums charted on the Billboard 200 in 1971 alone, an almost unheard-of pace of output for an artist who, at the start of that same calendar year, had only just become a recognizable name to American audiences, let alone a commercially bankable one capable of selling out venues across an entire continent he had never previously performed on. By the mid-1970s, at the height of his decade-defining run, John and Topin were producing what the Rolling Stone Encyclopedia of Rock and Roll would later describe as a virtual hit factory. 26 top 40 singles, 16 top 10 hits, and 6 number 1 singles across the decade. By 1973, the team had scored their first U.S. number 1 single with Crocodile Rock. The wealth that came with that output was not the product of one song alone sustaining him for years. It was the product of an entire decade of relentless output that Your Song had set in motion, each subsequent album cycle adding further to a fortune that had begun, quite literally, with a 15-minute lyric written at a breakfast table. The scale of that wealth and fame, once it fully arrived, became almost impossible to overstate. By 1976, when journalist Wayne Robbins interviewed Bernie Taupin at the Sherry Netherland Hotel in New York, he noted that Elton John had already become the biggest star of the decade, with 42 million albums and 20 million singles sold to that point, figures that stood in almost surreal contrast to the unknown songwriter who had failed an audition at Liberty Records less than a decade earlier and spent his early career writing songs for other performers to record. The wealth that followed was real, well documented, and arrived with a speed that startled even the people closest to him. Years later, reflecting on how quickly it had all happened, John himself pointed directly back to that single week in Los Angeles as the true beginning. "I think the start of all the success was the Troubadour thing," he said. "It was just amazing. It's an incredibly funky little place, the best club of its kind anywhere, and all it is some wooden tables and chairs and good acoustics." Bernie Taupin, for his part, has called Your Song something closer to family than to a hit record. The song that started everything, written in 15 minutes at a kitchen table by two young men who, only a few years earlier, hadn't even passed the audition that brought them together in the first place. Taupin has said, "It remains the song he remembers most vividly, of everything the two of them ever wrote." Recalling the morning it was written, he has said, "As clearly as if it happened yesterday."
This is the song in me.
If this story brought back a memory of the first time you heard your song, or made you think differently about how fast fortune and fame can actually arrive once the right song finds the right audience, let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed learning the real story behind it, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.